Thank you for having me here. And it really is sort of a perfect forum to talk about what happened in Flint because of the way that journalism and science meshed in order to get to the truth about what was going on there and exposing the problem. The third leg of that, though, were the citizen activists who were really the pivotal people in bringing this problem to light. And so we're going to start off. There's a short video that was released almost exactly a year ago. And it's pretty amazing to be standing here right now and talking about this because no one was talking about Flint a year ago when we released this video. No one at all. Local media was basically parroting the state and city line that the water was safe, and the citizens at that point were alone in standing up and trying to get people to pay attention to what was going on. And the arc of this story in the past year is pretty incredible. But so this video, a lot of it was filmed in April of 15. We worked on it for a couple months, and so this was really almost exactly a year ago that we released this.
We knew that this emergency manager law was undemocratic. We knew it was unprecedented, but we never dreamed that we would be faced with not being able to use our municipal water.
Was shut off, and the city of Flint's main source of water is now the Flint River.
When we heard it on the news that we might be drinking Flint water, might be going to that, we all thought it was a joke. Because everybody knows how gross the Flint River is. I think there was a Guinness Book of World Records broken brownie shopping carts were in one body of water.
Here's the Flint.
And then when of course the snow fell, there was 2 bodies found in it.
Some residents are wondering, will we see a change?
Average resident won't notice any difference.
My water's been brown since the switch.
The work that has gone into preparing the city of Flint to eliminate its dependence on Detroit Water and Sewer Department, that's a major step, a huge step in the right direction, because it now gives you the opportunity to better control the cost.
Who pays the highest price in Genesee County for water?
You have older women and older men out here, and they're trying to survive just off of their pensions.
There's no relief for your bills, you're going to get shut off, and then everybody knows. You lose your water for 90 days, they cap your sewer, condemn your home, take your children.
On one side was the city of Flint's finances, and on the other side was the health of the citizens of Flint.
We've had 3 or 4 boil water advisories.
The rashes, the hair loss, the muscle stiffness, the soreness. My family broke out in a rash that we were told looks like scabies, but it wasn't scabies.
For instance, right now, we don't baptize. If we baptize, we have to go outside of the city of Flint.
The minute we failed that first test, we should have known.
We ran into some bumps, but what did we do?
When that happened?
Didn't tell us.
January.
When we knew about that, we started immediately to address the problem.
Without telling the public.
We're telling you now.
And when you get to the point where you feel like it don't matter what I say or do, they gonna do what they wanna do anyway, that's a sad day for America.
Flint residents have nothing to worry about.
Those levels are back to normal.
If you don't believe that particular test, then that's your prerogative. This is a democracy.
How is this democracy?
Well, as much as we have for now.
Now we've done research, that's what's on our website. Link after study after result, we have an old infrastructure. When you change your source water, you disrupt the biofilm that's already built up in those pipes. The pipes are eating themselves from the inside out. Come to find out, I have hemolytic anemia, which now we find is caused by copper toxicity. In April, beginning of April, we found out my child had lead poisoning, and that's when the city came out and shut my water off. On Detroit, we didn't have these issues. Put us back on Detroit until you can figure out what you're doing and prove to us beyond a doubt that this water is clean and safe.
Detroit water, can we hook up again to the Detroit water? Great question, everybody's asking, can we hook up? We can if we have a money tree. You decide we hooked up on that, so that's the answer to that question.
Do you live in Flint?
You are literally in a fight for your life right now.
I'm terrified of what, the outcome of this, the aftermath of this could be, neurologically, for my children.
We are being saddled with this toxic water because we're under a toxic system, under emergency management.
Sir, gentlemen, sir, I'm not killing anybody.
We feel like we live in a third world country. We're getting poisoned water, and we have no right.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So there is a lot of stuff. That's just a 6-minute video, but there's a lot of really important issues that are touched upon that. The primary one is, and the reason that I was hired to focus on is Michigan's emergency manager law, which is the most extreme receivership law in the United States. Although as I was researching the topic, I understand that Rhode Island's receivership law is a pretty close second. But under Michigan law, if a school district or city or county is deemed by the state to be in financial distress, they can come in and completely take it over by appointing what's called an emergency manager. And these emergency managers basically have unlimited, unchecked power. They can eliminate existing ordinances, create new ordinances, take away health care benefits from retirees, negate collective bargaining agreements, break contracts, and there's no checks whatsoever. The one thing that the law says that they cannot do is miss a bond payment. So really this is kind of austerity playing out in America, just as it's playing out on the world stage in countries like Greece, where you have to make these massive cuts because the primary obligation is that you have to pay off the creditors no matter what. And in Flint, making sure that the creditors got paid meant poisoning a town's water supply. This is austerity, and it is a, dictatorship is a pretty loaded word, but I don't know what other word really works better when people have no access to democracy, which is what happened in Flint. They had no control over something as essential as their municipal water supply. As a matter of fact, at one point, the city council voted to return to the Detroit system, which had been providing clean, safe water for 50 years, and the emergency manager said, no, you can't afford it. You saw a clip of that there. And another thing I think that comes across in this is the callous disregard that those appointed officials have for the people that they are supposed to be serving. They don't care what the people think, because unlike an elected politician, if an elected politician talked to his constituents that way, they would not be an elected politician for very long. They'd be voted out of office. But these guys don't have to worry. They serve at the pleasure of the governor, and so can talk to those people really any way they want to, because they don't have to worry about any repercussions for just dismissing the concerns and really just talking down to them in a way that everyone else would consider unacceptable, which they considered unacceptable. Another thing in this video is that Leanne Walters, one of the moms, who's a really amazing person. So that we recorded her in April of 2015, and she's sitting on the stoop of her house saying exactly what the problem was, that the water was too corrosive and it was destroyed the biofilm that had been built up over decades because of corrosion control phosphates that Detroit added to the water. Leanne didn't disclose it at this point, but she had learned on her own by talking with someone at the water department that after the switch to this highly corrosive river water, the decision was made not to use mandatory corrosion control chemicals, phosphates. And that's what was basically chewing up the pipes and causing lead and to leach into the water. And so here's just a mom with no more of a high school education explaining exactly what was going on when the experts paid for with taxpayer money are saying that there's no problem. And so the role of citizen activism in this cannot be overstated. A lot of the film footage in this were people going to meetings and on their phones, taking video and capturing the actions of these emergency managers, or the line that always gets a laugh is the mayor saying, well, it's as much of a democracy as we have right now. I mean, so they were citizen journalists and citizen scientists, and they were the ones that were relentless in not believing the lie that the government was telling them that the water was safe to drink when, water's coming out of the tap and it's brown and tastes like crap, and these sometimes smells like swamp water or sometimes smells like rotten eggs. You can have all the experts in the world telling you it's safe, but in your gut that it's not. And so this was the situation a year ago. And we released the video, and right around the time that we released the video, a water expert for the Region 5 in Chicago for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency had been contacted by Leanne Walters. She was really relentless. She found out that there was high lead levels in her water. Then she found out that one of her 4 kids had been lead poisoned, and she was relentless in wanting to get to the truth. And so she kept reaching out to different public officials trying to get help. Finally, she found Miguel del Toro, who, out of everybody, was the one person that acted with a conscience and actually did what he was supposed to do, did his job. He looked into what was going on at her house. And saw that there was no lead plumbing in the house. Flint is a very poor town. Like all the cities, with the one exception that were taken over by emergency managers in Michigan and the school districts, has a majority African American population and a high poverty rate. Poverty rate's about 40%. And so the cities getting taken over are minority communities and poor communities. So this is very much a race issue and very much a class issue, what's going on here. Miguel determined that there was no lead in the house because the house had been vacant, like a lot of houses in Flint and Detroit as well. If a house is vacant, scrappers come in and steal everything worth stealing, and that includes metal, iron pipes and stuff, which they then sell off. And so the house had been stripped of everything. And so when they bought it, they put in PVC. And so there was no lead source within the house. And Miguel determined that. Leanne told him that the water department wasn't as in corrosion control. Miguel could not believe that, but checked it on his own and verified it. Then he hooked Leanne up with Mark Edwards at Virginia Tech. So for the scientists in the room, I would say that there is no better role model than Mark Edwards. He's an environmental engineer, and he is the person that discovered the lead and water crisis in Washington, D.C. in the early 2000s, and battled government then, and so was very much aware of how things worked. Miguel hooked up Leanne with Mark, who sent 30 sample kits to her house and walked her through to do a very, very thorough sampling of the water coming into her house. One of those samples found lead levels of 13,200 parts per billion. So to put that in perspective, first of all, 0 lead levels are safe. No lead, especially if you have young children, is safe. You don't want any lead whatsoever in your water. The US EPA's action level is 15 parts per billion. If there's 15 parts per billion or higher, then some action has to be taken. And they're in the process now, largely as a result of Flint, of looking at revising those standards even lower. Before this all erupted, they were looking at changing the rules in a way that would have made it more difficult to detect. Now it's, according to Edwards, a 180-degree turn. At 5,000 parts per billion lead levels, water is considered hazardous waste. And so one of these samples found 2.5 times hazardous waste levels of lead going into the water. So Del Toro took all this information and wrote a memo talking about what was going on in Flint and saying, based on what they had found in this one house, the corrosivity of the river, the fact that they were not using corrosion control, that this was almost certainly not an isolated problem, and that there was a very great reason for concern about what was happening in Flint in general, especially for homes that had lead service lines, which is older homes. The service line, there's a water main that goes down the middle of the street, and off of that water main is a pipe that connects the water main to each individual home's plumbing. That's called a service line. And in older neighborhoods, they tend to be made of lead. The estimate right now, the best estimate is that maybe there's 10,000 of these lead service lines in Flint. And so Del Toro was saying that this is a problem. This is a real concern. He's also been in the EPA for almost 30 years at that point, knew how the bureaucracy worked, and was very concerned that this memo that he wrote, internal memo, would get watered it down and buried in the bureaucracy. So he gave a copy of it to Leanne, knowing that Leanne was not going to sit on it. And because we took their concerns seriously in this short documentary here, because we gave credence to the concerns that the citizens were voicing, she trusted us to tell the truth and gave us that memo. And we published it on the web. I did a story about it. I interviewed Edwards extensively so that I understood the science of what was going on. Talked to Del Toro, who's told me why he did what he did. He ended up getting into a lot of trouble for doing that. Was pulled off of the Flint case for a very long time for doing that. But the information was out there. I tried to interview the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. They blew me off. They wouldn't answer my questions. Subsequent emails that were disclosed show their internal communications talking about this reporter from the ACLU who has been calling. And they put the word reporter in quotes. They didn't really consider me a reporter. And I mean, they're not alone. When we submitted the work to the Pulitzer Committee, they rejected it because I work for an advocacy organization. And so for the journalists in the audience, there's a really legitimate debate about whether someone like me who works for an advocacy organization can rightly be considered a journalist. And I think it's a very, very interesting debate. But I do know that whatever you want to call me, when I came to this job, I brought to it the mindset of a reporter, and that I had to be absolutely accurate and fair in how I reported this if it was going to have any credibility. Because the last thing you want as a journalist, if you want to continue being a journalist, is to not have credibility or to be considered a hack, someone that's mouthing some party line under the auspices of a journalism or the corporate line or whatever it is. And so, that kind of integrity was crucial to me being a success in this job, whether people want to call me a journalist or not. The important thing is the work. And if the work stands on itself, I don't really care if people consider me a legitimate journalist or not, as long as the work is credible. So we released it. Michigan radio, public radio in Michigan jumped on it right away. They more than anybody else in the mainstream media saw the importance of this, the significance of it if it was true. They called the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, and the spokesman for the MDEQ, a guy named Brad Werfel, former spokesman, I should say. He is no longer in his job, had to resign in disgrace, said, when it comes to lead in Flint's water, there's no overall problem. The people there should just relax. Again, remember, Leanne Walters in April saying, this is what's going on. Our pipes are being chewed up from the inside out. Lead's getting into the water. Brad Werfel in July, this was July 13th at this point. People can just relax. There's no overall problem. So at that point, what I had on my hands was classic he said, she said story, right? You got Brad Werfel and the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality saying that the water is safe, just relax. You got Miguel Del Toro's memo saying that this is alarm should be going off everywhere. So how do you get to the truth? And I had some money in my grant to pay for experts. I I contacted Edwards and said, how much does it cost to do one of these tests? Well, it's pretty expensive if you go to a private lab, but we could do it for $70 a shot. How many do you need to get a statistically valid sample? 50 would be the minimum, 100 would be better. So I started talking to my bosses. They're saying, why are you dealing with someone in Virginia? You know, there's lots of good universities here in Michigan. Why don't you see if they might do this? And so while I was doing that, Edwards got the idea of applying to the National Science Foundation for an emergency grant. Typically the kind of thing you do with like after a hurricane in New Orleans or something. And they came through with $50,000. And that turned out to be really a blessing in a couple ways. One is they came up with more money than I would have had available. And also the national, it's like me being a journalist, right? The National Science Foundation, there's no ulterior motive there. They're just pure science. Whereas if it was the ACLU funding it, it would have been, you know, some doubt, right? Because we are an advocacy organization, and so people would say, oh, you know, you can't trust it because it's from the ACLU. So it really turned out to be a blessing that Edwards took the approach that he did. He took and sent 300 sample kits to Flint. When he applied for this grant, he budgeted for 75 to be returned. And this is, again, in terms of the journalism, this is, I think, you know, would mainstream journalists have done what I did? I don't know. But I started working with Edwards and the residents to help coordinate the distribution and collection of these sampling kits. Because part of it was I wanted to be involved because I wanted to make sure that that process had integrity. But the citizens did too. We all knew that the other side was going to come after us and attack us no matter what. But we were determined to make sure that we did not give them any legitimate openings to attack us. So we held meetings and explained to citizens what we were doing and how to draw the samples. It was more extensive sampling than what the EPA required. And so we just, Virginia Tech produced a video that we showing people how to do it. We got the sample kits distributed. When we hit the 200 mark, we all sat down. The residents were very good. I mean, they had everything on index cards, and you know, who handed the sample out, who collected the sample, contact information for the residents, everything. And so we sat there and we mapped out, literally got a map and all of the addresses to see where they had been distributed, and then went out knocking on doors for the final 100 in areas that were light, because we wanted to make sure that every part of the city was being hit, so they could not accuse us of like cherry picking the worst areas. Although, under the federal law for this, it's called the lead and copper rule, sampling, the government is supposed to only sample water from high-risk homes, meaning homes with lead service lines or internal lead plumbing, because the thinking is, the correct thinking is, that you want to go looking for lead where lead is most likely to exist. And so if we had just focused on areas where it was a concern, that would have been actually the correct thing. But in a sense, our sampling was random in that we did not know if these were high-risk homes or not. The city, on the other hand, was supposed to only test these high-risk homes. And so, again, back to the scientists, if you were to set this up as an experiment and say, which group is going to come up with the higher levels? The controlled group, where they know, or are supposed to know that the homes are high-risk homes, or the group where it's random and you do not know, well, you would say, a hypothesis would be, well, it's going to be the control group where we know it's the high lead. It's not the way it turned out. Let me just take one step back and say, instead of the 75 kits that Edwards budgeted to have returned, we collected 277 because the residents were so determined to find out what was going on, and they were relentless. Leanne Walters was involved. At one point I said, Lee, I swear you would crawl over broken glass on your hands and knees to get one more sample kit. And, kind of joking. She looked at it and goes, oh yeah. It was like they were going to do this no matter what. Matter of fact, she was going to have back surgery in a couple days and was still like driving around in her minivan collecting these samples. And there's one scene that's not in here, but it's to me it's always kind of hard to talk about without choking up a little bit, which is a little goofy. But in the basement of this church, we had all the samples, these boxes for Virginia Tech delivered, and one of the activists, this woman named Naira Sharif, we're videoing her, and we said, "What's going on here, Naira?" And she said, we got these sample kits from Virginia Tech and we're going to get them out to the people and we're going to find out the truth about what's in our water. And that's what we were doing. We were just trying to find out the truth. Virginia Tech, as soon as they started analyzing the samples, saw very high lead levels, much higher than what the city and state were claiming. So then, along with doing that, I started doing a parallel investigation because the question is going to be, how is it that Virginia Tech is finding these high levels and the city and state are finding these low levels? Would have been another he said, she said situation, which, as a journalist you hate. You don't want to just leave, well, it could be this or it could be that. It's like, no, what's the truth? Just like they want to find out the truth about what's in the water. So in order to be able to answer that question, I started doing an independent investigation, working very closely with Mark Edwards. Again, Mark Edwards is a role model. I think if anybody should have won a Pulitzer for this, it should be Mark Edwards, because they created a website, they started posting information as it became available, because they saw this as a public health crisis, and they it's not like a normal study where you take it and you get it peer reviewed and 2 years later you release the results. This was like happening in real time. As soon as they're getting those results, they're putting them up on the web. They're calling people saying, stop drinking your water. And he also, I started filing FOIAs, and then Mark also started filing FOIAs, and we were sharing them. I was sharing with him what I was finding, because he helped me understand it, and he started sharing with me what he was finding. But I was doing it initially, focusing on the city. And so the answer to the question, how do you explain the difference between the cities and states results and Virginia Tech's? And the answer is, well, the city and state are cheating. They did not verify that the homes that they were testing were high risk. Matter of fact, in some cases, they went and tested in areas where they knew the results were going to be low. And that's not just conjecture. That was verified in the documents. And now, subsequently, criminal charges have been filed against one city employee and 2 state employees. And the fact that they were cheating on their tests was the basis for those criminal charges. And now, one of the results of Flint having been exposed is that journalists are looking at what's going on in other cities. And the Guardian just did a very, very excellent investigation and found that a number of cities are cheating, because there's a high incentive to cheat. Because if you exceed the federal action level, if 10% of the homes that you test are above 15 parts per billion, then you have to start taking significant action, likely starting to replace lead service lines, which is very, very expensive. I think the average is $3,000 or $4,000. And so, you know, municipalities all over are strapped for cash. They're just scared to death of having to incur the cost of replacing these lead service lines. And so there's a high motivation to cheat. One of the main ways they cheat, what they're doing in Flint, what they're doing in Michigan, is instructing people to pre-flush their lines. The way the law says is the water has to remain stagnant for at least 6 hours. There's no upper level in the law. A lot of places are doing is that they're instructing people to say, okay, gotta sit for at least 6 hours. But before you let it sit for 6 hours, run your water for 5 minutes. And so what that does is it gets the water from the main, which is the cleanest, least contaminated water, and flushes it through the system, gets it all cleared out. And then Michigan also, they were putting an upper limit of 8 hours on it. So what they were doing is really artificially constructing the most narrow time frame at all for which the water is sitting stagnant. And the longer it sits stagnant, the more lead that it absorbs. So this is one way that they're cheating. And another way, and this is like so sneaky, it's almost unbelievable. You're supposed to turn the water on full speed because running full speed is going to be more likely to dislodge any loose lead particles, right? When Virginia Tech came, their sample bottles, they had mouths like mayonnaise jars. So you can put it under the tap, turn it on full speed, and take your sample. The bottles that the state was distributing were like soda bottles, right? Little narrow mouths, so that you turn it on and you're going to turn it on slow because you don't want it splashing all over. So they were doing all these things. Some of it was avoiding or finding loopholes in the law and exploiting them, and some of it was outright cheating. So in September, we held a news conference on the front lawn of the Flint City Hall, and Edwards disclosed what they had found in their test and said, there's a definite lead problem in Flint's water. I got up there and talked about what I had found in terms of my investigation and said they cheated on their tests. There needs to be a formal investigation into what went on here. The state came back and said, we've been testing the water's safe. They didn't respond to my allegations at all. Then a doctor at Hurley Children's Hospital, Mona Hanna-Attisha, got the idea of looking at blood lead levels in kids. And she compared 9 months before the switch to 9 months after the switch and found that the percentage of kids with elevated levels of lead in their blood doubled after the switch to the river. And in the areas of the city where we found the highest levels of lead in the water, the percentage of kids with elevated lead levels almost tripled after the switch. So, you know, she wouldn't use the word correlation, but it was pretty clear correlation between the switch to the river, lead in the water, and increasing the levels of lead in kids. And the lead is a powerful neurotoxin that's especially harmful to pregnant women and young children. It causes learning disabilities, behavioral problems, lots and lots of problems. And that was really Hanna-Attisha's study, even though the state initially attacked her and said that she spliced and diced her data. That was their MO every step along the way. The people that were telling the truth, their claims were denied and their motives were attacked. The spokesman for the MDEQ about Edwards said, oh, they pull this rabbit out of this hat wherever they go, in an email to a reporter. But then the Free Press analyzed the state's data and said, you know, you guys are wrong. Your own data confirms what Hanna-Attisha reported. And after that was the game. That was game over, really, at that point in terms of denial. Within a month, the governor was forced to allow Flint to switch back to the Detroit system. But the water is still not safe. So much damage was done to the infrastructure that the water is still not safe. They're still not meeting the federal 15 parts per billion level. But as Edwards now says, this is the most heavily studied and monitored water system in the nation. The world knows about it. I got a call from the BBC the other day that's working on a story about this. So it's not just a national issue. The whole issue of lead in water, people everywhere are asking questions and taking closer looks at it. And so within the year of this video being released, that's where we're at now. It has become part of a national conversation. And I think my time is up, and we'll do question and answer at this point.